So Dan, your work has been, for years, you've been doing great work in the area of countercultural business practices. But there's that old adage, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But you're saying maybe not. Tell us a little bit about that.
And maybe I'll start with how I got to this.
Yeah, I'd love to hear
It's really going back in time before I became an academic. I was in Romania, which is my home country, and I decided to work for a multinational corporation, a North American corporation that just came to Romania after 40 years of communism. Suddenly there was this opening to other companies to come in the country. And the surprise I had was that they were not adapting to the Romanian culture. And even more surprising is that that was a good thing.
Welcome to International Business Today, where we discuss the most critical issues in international business with top academic experts and thought leaders. I'm Paula Kelajuri, a professor in the International Business and Strategy Group at Northeastern University's DeMoore McKim School of Business, the sponsor of this podcast. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Dan Caprar. Dan is an associate professor of the University of Sydney's Business School. Dan is a leading expert in cross-cultural management, specifically in the area of counterculture business practices. Dan, welcome to International Business Today.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you for having me.
So Dan, you just flew in from Australia.
Yes, well, actually from Europe this time.
Oh, okay.
Australia, Europe, and then here.
And you're looking great. They said they lost your luggage.
I just look great. I'm not that great.
Well, we really appreciate you being a part of the show
thank you.
today. So Dan, your work has been, for years, you've been doing great work in the area of countercultural business practices. But there's that old adage, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But you're saying maybe not. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, maybe not, and maybe not always. Probably better way to put it. It's very interesting because, as you know very well, you are in this field as well. In our studies and in our practice, we emphasize very much how important it is to adapt when you go to another culture. And it is important to do that. But it is a bit too general when we put it this way. And maybe I'll start with how I got to this.
Yeah,
I'd
love to hear
it's really going back in time before I became an academic. I was in Romania, which is my home country, and I decided to work for a multinational corporation, a North American corporation that just came to Romania after 40 years of communism. Suddenly there was this opening to other companies to come in the country. And of course, with the company came a culture which was not Romanian. It was very North American. That's how they were doing things. And the surprise I had was that they were not adapting to the Romanian culture. And even more surprising is that that was a good thing. People were very excited about the new ways of doing things, and they embraced the new culture. And maybe there is a specific situation there because it was the history that people wanted to get rid of, kind of leave behind. But there was also something about what works better. To give you an example, Romanian culture is, let's say, more relaxed about time, or at least traditionally speaking, like many other cultures, right, that we know about. And when you do business, that doesn't work well sometimes. They came with, no, time is money. We need to do things in a certain way. And people were excited about that. So for me, that's where I started wondering, well, wait a minute, where is that when in Rome, do as Romans do? What happened to that? And this works. So something in Romania too. And then I went to do my PhD in the US, and I encountered again and again that same principle. You need to adapt, you need to adapt. And I think it's important to mention here, that's a good thing. And it came from the history of American and other Western companies going to other cultures and encountering a lot of problems because they did not take into account what the local culture was. So that's where adaptation was important, but we went too far in that direction. And that's when I started thinking, and then I went back to Romania and studied that phenomenon and going and talking to people in multinationals and seeing how they respond to a different culture coming to their country and discovering that sometimes doing things in a way that's different from what the local culture would do can be good. And not only people would be embracing it and be open to that, it really works better sometimes, but not always.
Not always, and not for everyone. And those
Right.
those are both two really interesting pieces of this, right? So I would imagine that some of your colleagues, I mean, even going back to your Romanian example, when the North American organization came in and they were doing things more of a North American way, that there were some people who said,
Of course, then
I'm out of here.
Exactly. And in my study that I did at that time for my thesis, for my PhD, I discovered exactly that there was a range of responses to it. Some people embracing it and adapting to the culture that was brought with the company. Some people rejecting it and having a hard time with it. Some people being completely lost in between the two, not knowing anymore, am I still Romanian? Have I adapted to the organization and the culture here and I'm not a Romanian? What am I? And some people, and this is the interesting part, managing somehow to bring the two together. We call that integration, where they could function very well, both in the American way or North American way and the Romanian way. And what's interesting about that, these people are like people that go to another country, but they actually do that every single day. In the morning, they go to this foreign place, and then they go home, and they have at home the family and friends. They still behave largely based on the local culture. And that was a very interesting point, again, to think about what do we do then about these big principles that we have and we use as a rule in business that maybe we need to approach with a bit more nuance.
I mean, you and I have done research in this area together on
Yes,
it. And I
yes.
think at the individual level, we're seeing, on that cultural agility side, right? There's sometimes when people, as you describe, minimize culture, it's like saying, hey, no. This is the way we're going to have to do it. We might need to persuade or motivate someone to do it a certain way, but we're basically going to say we're overriding culture.
Yeah.
And other times we really do need to adapt sales, customer service,
Right.
relations. And there's other times when integration, we need to slow it down, not my way, not your way, but
Yeah.
our way.
And you didn't mention here your concept that you brought to the community, the cultural agility, right? Which is exactly what you're describing, which I think is fantastic. And it is about that, being able to read what's needed and think about what do I want to achieve, what's appropriate to do here, and then decide whether I adapt or not, and what's the best way to go about. But for me, what I tried to bring to attention was this idea that countercultural is not always bad.
Right. And that's such a critical piece. So for the listeners of International Business Today, how do they know? Like, how do they know when they go into a situation whether they're supposed to be adapting or not?
That's a very, very important question, and one that we need to talk about. And I'm glad you asked that, because it's not that easy. But that's the beauty of working internationally, I think. And how do you know? I mean, there are a few criteria you can use. But to a large extent, I would bring it down to make sure you pay attention to what you're dealing with and keeping in mind also what you want to achieve. And we go back to that idea of strategic intent, right? What is it that we're trying to do in this country? But that doesn't mean I'm going to go and do whatever I want and this is what I've learned works best and I'm going to do that. It means I'm taking that into account and I'm paying attention to what the locals like to do or how they like to do things. And then reading the situation, I can decide, well, in this case, it's better to adapt. In this case, maybe not. And again, to take an example, maybe that's easier. Let's talk about gender equality, right? It's a very good example to think about how that's something that's different from culture to culture. Most countries in the world are making progress on that, some more than others, but there is a lot of work to do. And in some cultures, we really need to do a lot of work in that space. So let's say I'm coming from a country that values equality, and I go into a country where gender equality is still not happening. Should you adapt and treat women the wrong way? Definitely not.
I was going to say, okay, that's a non-negotiable.
Exactly. So in that case, going counterculturally, it's no question, right? And of course, you still have to be careful about being sensitive. You don't approach that by going and saying, you don't know what you're doing, this is wrong. You might have that stance that we do believe in equality, but you have to think about how you bring it about in your organization in a way that's well received. And this is what we found when we look at research on countercultural practices. This is one of the examples when we discover, let's say, in certain countries, and maybe I shouldn't mention to not point out the particular countries, the employees actually valued the approach of the multinational that came with a very different view on that specific topic. So sometimes it's going to be very clear like this. You have some moral or basic values that you come with and you want to uphold. Sometimes
corporate
it's
values or corporate ethics.
exactly. And we talk nowadays a lot about responsible management, right? We, as multinationals or corporations or business, whatever you want to take, you go and you want to make a better world. And of course, who decides what a better world could be something that we need to talk about. But on particular aspects like this one, you don't have to think too much. You know that I'm not going to adapt. Now, in other situation, let's say if I'm working on marketing and I do want to appeal to a particular audience, I need to take into account what's happening there. But how I find out, again, it's a lot of observation, paying attention, taking that learning stance, which I think it's essential when you work globally, and I know you believe in that too, where you want to look at what's going on and then make decisions as opposed to applying some very high-level principles.
And that's when those bicultural individuals become so instrumental for your organization, because they really can see the lens, through two different eyes. That's about
right. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's so fascinating. I always go back to remember Ben Schneider's work on attraction, selection, attrition. Who are you attracting into this sort of counterculture organization? Yeah. Who's kind of staying, right? And who's leaving? And that's really what ends up over time becoming a different corporate culture, even though it's residing within a broader sort of national culture.
Yeah,
so kind of
and you make here an interesting point that I think we could talk about because it's important related to a question, how do we know? We tend, or we used to back in time, to look at the culture at the national level. And we say, I'm going to China, Chinese do things this way, that's what we need to take into account. That's still valuable because there is some knowledge there that might be useful. But I always tell the executives I work with and my students, take that as a hypothesis. Go and test it. Because there are subcultures, right? So I might have somebody in China that has either been exposed to different ideas, or the culture has evolved, or they come from a particular part of the culture, and there are subcultures, and they do not really behave according to that old template of what China at the big level it is. I mean, that generalization, it's right away not a good one. China, it's a very big country with a lot of regions and lots of differences, but that applies to any other country. There is a lot of intra-cultural variability that we need to take into account. I mean, I like to think many times about a teenager in Beijing might have more in common with a teenager in New York,
generational culture,
right, or Sao Paulo, or wherever we might go, than somebody that's in their family. So that's why going with those principles, and especially thinking of culture just at the country level, doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you and I both teach our students and work with executives in the same way. I always like using, so we use my guide to get people to understand their own cultural values. And then we do ask them to, first thing we do is we say, okay, I would default to sort of compare your cultural values to your home country. And look, you're not exactly your home country. Why not?
Yes, exactly.
It's really interesting to see. It could be generational. It could be part of the world you were raised in, or part of the country you were raised in.
Yeah. And there is another element that complicates everything. And again, we discover this when we study culture. Culture sometimes has these two layers of culture, how it should be, what we aspire to be, and culture as is, the practice. Sometimes they are not aligned. And maybe to explain that better at the individual level, I might want to be very organized, and I value that a lot, and I say it's important, but it doesn't mean I'm very organized. So what do you adapt to? The practice or the aspiration?
So I'm going to turn that one back on you. What do you adapt to? So a business leader is listening to this and saying, okay, well, which is it?
And then what do I do?
And what do I do, right? Do I kind of work toward the aspiration and work with it?
Let's say, again, going back to the previous example we had with gender equality, the aspiration might be in that country as well to solve that inequality. So I'm definitely going to adapt towards that aspiration as opposed to the practice. But right away, depending on what I'm looking at, you might say I'm adapting to the aspiration, or I'm going countercultural to the practice, right? So I know many executives ask me, well, just tell me what to do. It's not that easy. That's why you're here. And I'm telling them, what I'm telling you to do is to observe, to pay attention, to learn, to experiment, and to take into account the multiple elements that matter here. What do you want to achieve, where you come from, what's local, what's acceptable, what do we want to create together. And that it's something that brings us to what leadership is. For me these days, I work a lot with leaders, and I move from you come in and shape the world as you want it into you come in and learn with those you work with and shape it in a co-creation kind of space, or interdependence, if you want. It's not only what I want, it's also what you want, and what do we want to create together. And when you approach it that way, the answers come.
Yeah, then it's so important the way you're describing it, because some of the most critical global leadership competencies that have emerged, I mean, you and I have worked in this area together, humility. And it's that humility to say, look, I might be great at, finance, strategy, whatever, but I need to learn how to do that here.
Exactly.
And what that means here. Or things like relationship building, the idea that the only way to learn is through the people who know, and you can't alone understand everything about the culture without asking. Curiosity,
it's a big one.
Reading
Yes.
or learning, asking questions. Tolerance of ambiguity, suspending judgment for a while and being able to linger longer in that state of ambiguity.
Exactly.
Before you rush to a judgment. So all of those are so critical for groups. Let me pivot from individual leaders to teams, especially global teams, right? Virtual teams that aren't even co-located with one another. So can you talk a little bit about how culture plays within those teams? Like whose culture then dominates and which culture should, or how does a team create a culture?
Well, you just said what happens, right? Teams create a culture, and sometimes that happens by itself, and it might take a shape that's the one we want or the one that's helpful, or maybe not quite. Or we can have a deliberate approach to that, being very conscious of the fact I have a few people with different perspectives, and work on how do we want to work as a team. And that's again done by, let's bring everyone in. What do you prefer? What do you want? How do you like to do things? And how does that fit with what we want to achieve here? And let's say I'm coming from Romania, I'm a Romanian, say, traditional culture, maybe not anymore. I just want to come whenever I feel like, or maybe I'll be late and you should be okay with that. Well, maybe we shouldn't. Let's set up a new norm for this team. That doesn't mean it's yours or mine or whose norm it is, but it's a norm that fits us as a collective, and will say, we're going to be on time. And that might seem like I'm imposing now the Western style of relating to time, but it's not really about that. And if everyone understands what are the objectives and how we best achieve them, but that maybe also we relax a little bit sometimes and say, on certain situations or particular, we give you flexibility, because as we know, and COVID has taught us a lot in that space, even in Western cultures or cultures that have been very strict around time, now there is a little bit more openness to, can we be more flexible? Can we be more relaxed about that? There is value in that, because it has benefits on private life or well-being, or being a little bit less stressed when it comes to work, right? So that brings also this idea of what practice is best. There is no best, and maybe we need to approach every culture with every practice with that curiosity and understanding, where does it come from? It had a function. It has some benefits. It might not be the best thing to do, but for instance, even gender inequality, right? It's there for a reason. It's not something we want to keep doing, but it developed over time because there is a certain history, a certain evolution in the community. So it's very easy to go and say that's bad, but it's more appropriate and easier than when we come to teams that are very diverse to say, well, you have a certain approach. Let me understand why, where it's coming from. Is it still valuable to go this way? And then it's a better way to come together to some norms that we want to set up in this new team or new group or new organization, and work with that.
That makes perfect sense, to the idea of really kind of slowing down with the team and saying, okay, what do we want to, what are our behaviors? What are they going to look like unique to us? And ultimately, we're going to have a culture that might not look like the culture of the team in the group next to us, right?
Yeah.
We have our own. But what if those individuals aren't co-located? We've got a lot of layers, right? They're new to each other, so it might be a trust issue, it might be a collaboration issue. Well, how does that work? That's
a challenging issue, because we know from research that actually teams can work very well remotely, but it's always good if you can start together with some work in person. that's where we get to know each other. That's where we get to communicate even beyond the words that we can use in a remote meeting where we say, here's how we're going to work. You feel and you get a sense of everyone's engagement. And then it's much better than to move into remote mode and still be effective. And unfortunately, with this discovery, we can work remotely, that part is left out many times. And then later on, there are issues. I mean, we have this development of teams. There is a phase of coming together, and there is a model that says we go through a storming phase where we debate things. And sometimes that's being skipped because we go on Zoom and we've learned how to do this. Everyone knows how to operate with technology, and we think that's going to work. But I don't know, and that's a challenge because there are some practicalities to it, but I'm still encouraging companies, make sure you have a get-together in person first. It's an investment. Time, money, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. I would differentially invest in companies that are doing something at the onset of these teams to increase trust.
Yeah.
Trust will be so critical. And you're right. Once it's established, once we know each other, remote work is great. It makes it easier to collaborate, but we need to establish that trust first. It's so important. So Dan, you have lived just about everywhere. You've lived in Europe and Australia. You've lived in Asia. You lived in North America. You lived in South America.
For a short time, yes.
So from experience, can you give the listeners of International Business Today just some advice on being a global professional?
I tend to avoid giving advice because,
no matter what you give.
it depends on each situation. But there are some...
That's perfectly unbrand for you.
Yes. But if I had to think about, I'll go back to what we talked about earlier, this ability to learn all the time. For me, the biggest lesson from all this exposure to different cultures was to not take anything for granted in terms of what I know. And, I said I'm studying cross-cultural management. I've been curious about cultures for a long time, and I still made a lot of mistakes. And to give you a very simple example, probably the biggest mistake I made, moving from US to Australia, it's a Western culture. It's English mainly. I mean, it's multicultural country, but there is a lot of Anglo flavor to it based on the history that it has and the majority of people there. And right away, I started functioning. There is no big difference. I can function in this culture. It's not like going to a culture that's very different in Asia or South America. Big mistake. It looks very similar.
What were some of the big challenges that you had?
Well, I remember the first university I worked with there. I went with the same attitude from the US of taking a lot of initiative, having ideas. How do we improve this? How do we improve that? Which in the US worked very well. I got a lot of praise and appreciation for starting things and having initiative. And not that Australia would not value initiative, but how you bring it about has to be done in a different way. Australia, it's a very egalitarian culture. It has this, we call it the concept of mateship, right? And it goes back to the history of the country, where you don't want to stand out. And especially as a new person coming in, they want you to, and I think that's appropriate in any culture actually, to first learn a little bit what's happening, understand, bring about collaboration and discussion before you go and point out to what's wrong and what you want to fix. And I did that thinking I'm doing something good, that there was a program I wanted to improve and I was going all about it. And it's been perceived as, you're telling us we're not very good at what we're doing. And I could see a very negative reaction to it. There was also a little bit of context to it. I was coming from the US. There was a bit of resistance of this push from America in business schools coming and changing everything in how it's done to go more with the American model, which has advantages and disadvantages. And I think we evolved now to have a mix of some good things from the US and trying to be competitive on the global stage, but still having our own way to do it in Australia. At that time, I didn't appreciate that. And it took the reaction of people and me being very puzzled, what's going on? And then finally doing what you're supposed to do, approaching some of the colleagues and saying, what's happening? What am I doing wrong here? I'm trying to do my best and it's not received well. And then they told me. And there was such an eye-opening moment how, again, I was somebody who I thought I know a lot about cultures and cultural differences, and I was making such a basic mistakes because
We all do.
Exactly, because again, there was a similarity in culture that was misleading. Probably if I went to another country, I would have started more cautious because I knew it's a big difference. But because they looked, it's similar, it's the same kind of vibe. I had colleagues that published in the same journals, and it felt like, I'm in the same environment, but I wasn't.
If this makes you feel any better, we actually did a study, this was back in the 90s, that said exactly that adjustment was easier we were doing it on Anglos going to Anglo cultures versus Anglos going to non-Anglo cultures. Adjustment was easier for Anglos going to non-Anglo cultures for exactly that reason. You knew you were in a different culture, so you were more sensitive to it versus
and more aware of the difference, more paying attention, right? And that's so important, right? So again, going back to advice, don't think you know, don't believe what seems to be, but rather be really curious and go deeper into what's going on. I mean, I tend to, again, advise the executives I work with, and in my classes, I talk a lot about taking an anthropologist kind of stance, right? Anthropologists go and study cultures, and they just are very curious to understand what's going on there. And they don't judge it. If they see people eating something weird, they don't say, that's weird. That's interesting. Right. Let me see how you're doing that and why. That's the stance you want to approach every culture with. And then you get the information, the base that helps you then behave appropriately, come up with appropriate ways of adapting or not adapting or introducing new ideas. But you first need to understand. Yeah,
that's such a great approach. That's such great advice, even though you don't like to give it. That's such great advice to, have a little cultural humility and learn the context that you're in. Dan, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for being on International Business Today.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for today's episode of International Business Today. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your network. As always, we'd love to hear from you.